My name's Sarah Johnson, and I am thrilled to introduce our next distinguished speaker, Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence, for a conversation about the future of our intelligence and technology. Michael Morell, the former acting director of the CIA, will moderate this conversation.
Good afternoon, everybody. Avril, it is a thrill to be on the stage with you. The times that we work together are some of my most memorable, special, fun. So it's great to be with you again.
It's phenomenal. It's one of the advantages of being here is I actually get some time with Michael. So appreciate the opportunity.
So we're going to talk about the impact of emerging technologies on the intelligence community, on the job you have to do, on what you have to bring to the table, right? And maybe that's the best place to start, is to ask you to kind of frame the problem, right? All these emerging technologies, both by our adversaries and by us. How does that impact you? How do you think about that strategically?
Yeah, it's a huge question. And first of all, it's wonderful to be here. I think the summit is phenomenal and so much at the heart of where we have to basically evolve. Frankly, the sort of opportunity to discuss with both the private sector and the public sector some of the challenges that we have is critical, as will be obvious from our discussion, I think. But in terms of emerging technologies, I think maybe I'll start as follows. One is, it is clear that technologies and emerging disruptive technologies are having increasing impact on the national security world in a whole series of different ways. And in many respects, creating surprise in a whole area of spaces. And you can go from looking at UAV technology and, for example, how that affected the conflict in Ethiopia and sort of changed the dynamic there, to things like digital repression because of communication technology, just so many different ways to think about this. And I sit at ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and try to facilitate, in effect, the work that happens across the intelligence community in different elements. And when I look at different emerging technologies, there's kind of a rush to ensure that we understand the emerging technology that we're looking at, that we're using it appropriately for mission, because honestly, if we're not taking advantage of it, both within the intelligence community, but within the government writ large, then that can also become a threat because we are not keeping up to pace with what our competitors or adversaries are doing in these areas. It is also to understand essentially the potential threats that it poses and how it connects with other trends that we're seeing. And in doing that, we're looking at our own work. So if I just take generative AI as a kind of an example of this in a way, we may be looking at how that affects, for example, counterintelligence, right? So generative AI may make it easier for, in effect, other services, but also non-state actors that are interested in monitoring our activities to do so. We may be looking at it from the perspective of a cyber threat, a variety of things. We would also be looking to try to help the government understand threats more generally to our national security that are sort of traditional. Cyber obviously overlaps with that. That's going to be one of the things that we highlight. Disinformation in the context of election security. There might be bio. There's just a whole series of things that we're going to think about in that way. But one thing that people don't necessarily realize is that we're also being asked to think about this not just in the near term, but in the long term, and to really try to identify key disruptions for society that may intersect with national security. So we're trying to do analysis that helps us understand, for example, could it result in disruptions to the labor markets in different countries? If so, what would that look like? How would that intersect with other issues? And from an organizational perspective, we're trying to put together essentially a strategy for how we're approaching artificial intelligence writ large, kind of making sure that we're pushing in all the hard places, but also being thoughtful about privacy, civil liberties, ethics, other issues in terms of governance. We're thinking about, how it is that we build standards that allow us to actually have interoperability across the community. So things like data is an enormous asset that we have in government that makes it a potential advantage that we can have in the context of generative AI. But of course, unless we're actually able to combine data sets that we're thinking about from across the community, we may not be able to take as much advantage of that as we might otherwise consider. We have to develop mechanisms for facilitating collaboration. We have to think about funding for innovation and for scaling different solutions and options that we're focused on. There's just a whole variety of sort of organizational and structural things that we have to be on top of in order to take advantage and to also understand what the threats might be. But you're so familiar with all of this, Michael.
No.
Yeah, do you want
Great.
to add to that?
So, in terms of the threats, right, posed by our adversaries' use of this technology, what are the ones that worry you most when you look at the list of emerging technologies?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll start with generative AI and then I'll move out from there. So for generative AI, I think in a sense, the near term greatest threat is the disinformation potential and the capacity for that to be used in the context of elections and other things. And that's certainly something that we're very focused on. And it's also, obviously, cyber is another piece of this, counterintelligence, et cetera. But one thing that I just highlight about the threat in this space, and this is true for other technology areas too, is that we obviously think about state actors. That's sort of our business. But in many respects, what many of these technologies are doing is making it possible for a lower barrier of entry, basically, to be being a threat. In other words, empowering non-state entities as well, and making it cheaper and easier for them to access, the potential in effect. And also to think about how the state actors that we typically focus on are also, yes, going to be part of what we're going to be looking at in terms of the threat. But if you've got something that's cheaply available, that's commercially available, you might also see other state actors that typically would not be engaging in these kinds of threats doing so more because it's more available to them. And as a consequence, we need to keep an eye on that as well. So this is a part of the emerging technologies space, I'd say, that's true in a whole series of areas.
Quantum, synthetic biology,
yes,
and all of them enabled by AI?
Yeah, absolutely. Right? Yeah, and I was going to go to bio next because I do think it is one of the most incredibly important aspects of the threat landscape that we're facing. And it is, in a sense, in the bioconvergence space that we see the potential for more surprises in a way than what we would otherwise see in the context of a particular stream. And to your point, quantum comes into it as well. Like all of these things are interconnected and it has the capacity to interconnect in ways that create more threats. But at the same time, we recognize that we also as societies want to take advantage of the opportunities that many of these extraordinary developments provide. And, from my perspective, part of what we should be doing is helping to highlight that, to recognize how it is that we can participate in allowing for those opportunities as best we can while mitigating against the threats. And that is sort of the sweet space that we're trying to occupy in effect.
Yeah. When you do your assessments of foreign nations' capabilities in these areas, are you asked by policymakers to compare those to what's happening here?
Yeah.
Which is, countercultural?
Yeah, we were talking about this too. It is a really interesting. So, I mean, this is true across the board for our analysis of threats coming from adversaries, whether they're technology related or not, right? Which is to say that almost no matter what the threat is that you're telling the president or the National Security Council about, what they want to know is, so what do we have that can counter it, right? And how do we manage, in effect, how we're doing versus how they're doing in these different spaces. And something that I was mentioning to Michael that I see as a classic trend, that's relevant to other spaces and won't surprise you, I suspect, is it used to be, we talked about blue and red. It was kind of our classic analysis, right? Red being the adversary, blue being the United States. So how are we in comparison and how are we capable of countering and what's our sort of advantage or disadvantage in certain areas? And typically you would go to the Department of Defense to understand blue, right? Because they're the ones that are challenged, that are facing those threats typically in sort of hard national security, traditional national security spaces. Nowadays, increasingly, we go to the private sector to understand blue, right? Where are our companies? Where is our technology edge? How do we compare to adversaries? How do we calculate, in effect, or assess the delta between us? And what should we be most concerned about in terms of the factors that could lead to a vulnerability or a change in that?
In terms of bringing in technology to help you with your mission, right? Both because it's available and because you need to counter what the other guy's doing against you, right? What are the most important technologies, and how are you doing in terms of bringing those in?
It's mixed, I'd say. I mean, it is so across the board. There are different versions of how you bring in technology. It's such a huge kind of question ecosystem. So as an example, obviously, again, with generative AI, bringing it in, understanding, having the opportunity to test large language models and work with them is obviously critical for us, in doing that work. But we also have to make sure that we're thinking about the environments within which we're bringing them in and the data that we're using and our capacity to understand the quality of it and ultimately, therefore, what it is producing. If you're looking at, biotech, for example, and understanding sort of the advantages and the opportunities and a whole series of other technologies that we brought in, some of them related to artificial intelligence more generally or in other spaces. We have a whole series of mechanisms. Some of them are things like InQtel, which give us opportunities to match ourselves with companies on the outside that can produce things that can innovate and we can use for mission in different spaces. Some of it is related to bringing in expertise that allows us to develop things within the intelligence community. Often we are also working with universities or research institutes, and we have specific projects that we're focused on in developing them. And I think there's kind of an institutional piece of it, but there's also an expertise piece of it. And we've been trying to take advantage of effectively public-private partnership law that allows us to do more of those types of partnerships. And we've been focusing on space, on artificial intelligence, on some of the areas that you might imagine in high computing. And it's clunky at this stage, in my view. Like, it's one of those things where we're constantly kind of banging our head against the wall to make it work more effectively. But there are a lot of challenges. And this is an area where we're, consistently reviewing and trying to improve our capacity to do this. And we actually have a group that is looking at this to sort of from the outside and the inside to try to make sure that we actually have new ideas and are scaling best practices in different parts of the community so that we can engage more effectively in these areas.
So all of this stuff, and you've talked about this a little bit already, but everything you have to do, right? There has to be a partnership with the private sector because that's where the knowledge is, that's where the technology is. Is the private sector responding in a positive way? Do you get pushback? How's that working?
So one way to frame this for folks, to the extent that this is useful, if you think about, it is a clear trend line that the private sector is increasingly powerful in many respects within society, right? And in many ways, multinational corporations are setting agendas for themselves. They can be spoilers of government action, or they can create momentum, and they are a critical geopolitical force in many respects that we have to pay attention to. And as the intelligence community, we have traditionally been focused on state actors and proxies of state action. And yet, increasingly, we need to understand what the private sector is thinking and planning in a variety of areas. And that is a place where trying to make sure that we're engaging in those strategic conversations with the private sector is critical. And it's not that the private sector is resistant to that. It's more that we have to make sure that we're not just talking to the people who typically talk to us, but that we're actually engaging with different parts of the private sector to sort of have that kind of conversation. And, just to give a very brief example to bring this home, one of the things that, in the context of the Ukraine conflict, for example, Russia invades. We obviously have a reaction of sanctions among, the United States and allies and partners. And at the same time, key sectors of the private sector decide to self-sanction, right? Oil services, companies, others pull out, has a big impact. that is a useful thing for us to understand that they're going to do that has an impact on the sort of conflict and the way things are proceeding. And so, that's one piece of what we as the intelligence community need to engage on. A second piece is more along the lines of what we've been talking about, which is to say that increasingly the talent, the experience, the knowledge, innovation is happening in the private sector. And as a consequence, we have to have better ways, in effect, of having those kind of public-private partnerships where we're having folks go from the intelligence community, which we are doing now, to the private sector, learn about certain areas of innovation, for example, and then come back in to the intelligence community in order to be able to bring that knowledge in. Because if you are at the height of biotech, for example, chances are you're not going to think of the intelligence community as the place you want to go to work, right? If you're doing really advanced work, you're going to go to a place that is doing the most advanced work in biotech, and that's unlikely to be us. We have to have that kind of exchange and communication and engagement, but it really is a sort of a different version of partnership in a way. We also recognize that threats that we face are frequently ones where the information that is critical to us is in the private sector. So, for example, if you look at ransomware as a challenge more generally, our folks have been telling us, like, actually, there are companies that do ransomware negotiations. They actually understand what's happening in these spaces, right? We need to go talk to them. We need to understand what they're seeing in order to be able to really put together a comprehensive threat picture. And the great advantage that we can serve is to bring that information and combine it with the exquisite intelligence that we collect and then give a better sort of comprehensive picture. So all of those are a piece of the puzzle. And then finally, I'd say a third pillar that we have focused in on, again, it's somewhat obvious, but it is really the fact that the private sector is so much a part of, in a sense, our attack surface, right? So if you're thinking about the critical infrastructure, so much of it is owned by the private sector. We recognize we need to make sure that that critical infrastructure is capable of defending itself, that we're doing everything we can to help them, all of those things. But it extends beyond that, because that's been a pretty long conversation about how it is that we do that and improving our capacity to do that. If you think about our competition with China on technology issues, for example, we have to work with key sectors that are critical to that competition and ensure that they can protect their own intellectual property, that they can protect the expertise that they have, that we are working with them as much as possible to ensure that that they're hardened, in a sense, for those issues, and that they're able to see the picture that we see with respect to supply chains and other things. So there are just so many different elements of this that I think are critical for us to improve.
As you work through all of these issues, what's your role and what are the role of the agencies? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, OD&I is incredibly useful as a way of facilitating collaboration across the community. And sometimes that's as simple as us bringing together a task force of folks from the different agencies and departments. Like we did this when the sort of generative AI stuff was first working through, to get the community's experts on this together, right? And to allow them to start talking about what is the vision for the future that they think for their own elements, but then how does that work with others so that they can leverage each other's capacity? And then going out and talking to private sector experts on these issues so that they can learn from them together, because the conversation that they have amongst each other and with the private sector is actually some of the richest pieces of that kind of work that then leads to collaboration. And so that's a part of what we do. A part of what we do also is then helping to set, as I was saying, kind of standards across the intelligence community that allow for greater interoperability, that make sure that we're growing in ways that allow us to more effectively leverage each other, because it's a big community, as you know well. And actually setting those standards can actually have an enormous amount of impact, but you've got to get the right standards. So you're working with the community to figure out what that means and not overly restrictive and not creating problems for people, right? Like bureaucracy is challenging. It can be very effective under certain circumstances, but not so much under others. And then thinking about the governance framework for these things, working through, and I think this is for every technology area, we go through a civil liberties and privacy check, and it's crucial. It it's not something that is like a box that we have to check. It is really fundamental to our legitimacy and to our capacity to continue to do the work that we're doing. Because if we get that wrong, not only are we out of sync with the values that, we all were brought up to believe in and why we're working for the U.S. government, but also, ultimately we can create a challenge that undermines our legitimacy and our capacity to do that work. And, as we're in the context of right now, a big discussion over one of our main authorities, 702 authorities, surveillance authority. This is a clear space where, again, like if we don't convince folks that we are responsible with the authorities that are provided to us, we may lose them, right? So we have to make sure that we're baking that into the process, and Odie and I can do that. And then finally, the funding piece. And the funding piece is a kind of an obvious point in the sense that, of course, all of these things require resources and we need to promote funding. But it is also true that part of what we need to do is to help kind of create a different risk calculus for areas where we're in emerging technologies so as to promote innovation. So we can do things like set up funds that allow you to take more risk in effect, and as a consequence, see the advantage of doing so. Sometimes you'll fail, but sometimes you'll succeed, and that is important. And then
there's a pot of money where people can kind of bid on, and then you hand that out.
Exactly. And we do it in different things. We've had strategic investment group where we have a process where people can basically put out ideas, and then we have experts that look at what's the best kind of concept that might be funded by the community, so it doesn't come out of base budgets. And we've had some really creative ideas in the artificial intelligence space for doing this, but then also ones where smaller pots of money that you can kind of bid for that's more along the lines of what you're describing, and workforce stuff too.
Maybe another role you can play is I imagine that there's a lot of experimentation going on across the community on generative AI. And for you to take the best practices then to share them across the community, I think would be incredibly valuable.
We have a program called the Unity program that's supposed to do just that. It's actually focused on artificial intelligence, and it's supposed to help us take the best practice and then scale them and fund the scaling to some extent so as to be able to take advantage of it. I have to say, it's not worked as well as I would have liked it to. And it's one of the things that we're trying to figure out, like, how can we improve this in effect so that it does more of what it was intended to produce. But
okay, open source.
Yes.
Open source, something near and dear to my heart. You wrote about it before you began BNI. And here I guess we're talking about both publicly available information and commercially available information. There's a critique that the community's not doing enough, not bringing in enough open source. Walk us through where you are, where you'd like to be. How do you think about it, and how does a U.S. person's piece fit into this?
Yeah, there's a lot there. So we had a panel that looked at this basically. And when I first came in, based on my own experience and knowledge in the intelligence community, as Michael said, I wrote a study on this too, that I thought we needed to do more in this area. And one of the things that we found was that there actually is a lot going on across our community and open source. And it is valuable both sort of tactically, but also strategically in many respects. And that there was a recognition of that value. But there was not, and this is kind of classic, and you'll appreciate this, I think, like there was not sufficient investment in effectively the tools that would allow you to scale the sort of best practices across the IC on how you actually exploit open source information appropriately. And there was also not sort of consistent requirements being put down. So I'm trying to think like how that translates for folks who don't spend a lot of time in our world. But in essence, if you're an all source analyst in the intelligence community, what you're doing is you're looking at every int and you're trying to pull that information in and provide analysis based on that. And when you talk to different parts of the community and you talk to the all source analysts, they were the most dissatisfied with our sort of open source, effective work, because what we were finding was that there were sort of stovepipes of excellence where people were really doing great open source work for their closest client in a sense, but not really doing it strategically for the whole. And so a lot of what we're doing right now is trying to create an opportunity for us to do a sort of more coordinated open source requirement piece to build it in as the sort of into a first resort in a sense. So in other words, if you can do it as open source, right? If you can actually pull together the picture that you're looking for in that way, then why not do it using open source, publicly available information that you can use for that purpose? And then obviously you want the ability to combine it with sometimes the exquisite intelligence that we have in order to give a better picture more generally, but we want it to both be tactical and strategic. And it's incredibly useful and important. And it's critical too to the way we do business right now in terms of partners, because it gives us more opportunities to basically engage in that kind of exchange with the private sector, with other countries, and more generally. And then finally, on your U.S. person piece of this, I mean, I think one of the things that we recognize is that what we used to think about when I was ages ago, it feels like a lawyer in the government. I think about privacy-related information, personal information. We sort of had key things that we thought of as being personal, like your social security number. You sort of certain things that were particularly privacy-related information that needed to be protected. One of the challenges today is that there's so much information, and increasingly so, about all of our activities, right? And as you pull it together, particularly with sort of, extraordinary data exploitation tools that exist now that are easily available, you can actually reveal privacy information through that sort of mosaic of data. And that can be concerning too. And that's a perfectly reasonable concern for folks to have. And so what we've been, again, working through, and we released a panel report that we had done on this that looked at this issue, is basically trying to build a framework for dealing with commercially available information and thinking about where it is kind of particularly sensitive and creates that sort of problem. And then what are the safeguards that we apply in those spaces so that we can, again, be responsible in the way in which we approach this.
Avril, our time is running out. We could talk about this forever.
I know.
So great to be with you, and thank you.
Same. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks very much, everyone, for listening. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.